During the making of this film, we received this tape from Tucson, Arizona in the American Southwest. The tape shows people who only recently discovered just who they are. American Catholics, but descendants of Spanish Jews who were forcibly converted to Christianity centuries ago. Lupita Murillo is a TV reporter in Tucson, Arizona. Working on a program, Lupita learned of Hispanic families in Texas who had been observing certain traditions, unaware that they were Jewish in origin. They didn't eat pork or shellfish. They lit candles on Friday night and covered mirrors after a death in the family, all Jewish customs. For Lupita, it was a revelation. She remembers her grandmother observing exactly the same traditions, and Lupita is certain that she is a descendant of a Jewish family. Professor Abraham Channin heads the Jewish Archive Center of the University of Arizona and helps many families retrace their heritage.
The process is ongoing at this point. Many people are coming to us week by week to talk to us, tell us their story, and I would suppose that it will be a never-ending story, because as families get interest in tracing roots, then they will be coming to us again and again.
One of the people Channin helped is Melissa Amado, who traced her roots back to the noble Amado family of Valencia in Spain. It turned out the Amado family were Catholic, but also secret Jews. Carlos Bellas is a professor of anthropology in the University of Arizona. He learned of his Jewish heritage after the death of his only sister in 1960.
My mother turned to me and she said in Spanish to me, she said, "Mijo," which means my son. "Mijo, somos judíos."
The knowledge of being Jewish had until then been passed from mother to daughter. Ruth Reed is a translator who also discovered she is a descendant of Spanish Jews. A silver amulet inscribed in Hebrew with the 10 Commandments has been in her mother's family for generations, but her mother never spoke of her Jewish past.
No, she never did. The only one that talked about Jewish roots was my father. His name was Ruiz, R-U-I-Z. And that name is considered a Jewish name in Spanish countries.
The roots of all these people returned to Spain 5 centuries ago. Spain, Christmas Eve. Midnight Mass in the church of Santa Maria la Blanca in the Santa Cruz neighborhood of Seville. The local congregation have come to pray as they do every Christmas Eve for a good and fruitful year. But Santa Maria la Blanca is no ordinary church. It was built on the foundations of a synagogue, which stood centuries ago when Santa Cruz was the Jewish quarter of Seville. The synagogue entrance is still visible along the outer wall of the church. Once there was a great Jewish community in Spain. But in the year 1492, the Jews were exiled by royal decree. Their expulsion signaled the end of 1,000 years of Jewish life in Spain and changed the course of Jewish history. The exiled Jews dispersed to the 4 corners of the world. About a year ago, I was commissioned to write a film commemorating 500 years since the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, to tell the story of the process leading up to the exile, how it happened. I discovered a grand but tragic history and a remarkable heritage. Little remains of that heritage in the Spain of today. There are only stones and memories. But as we traveled in our search for Jewish roots, as we visited the towns and villages where Jews once lived, in the Spain of the Middle Ages, we still found traces of Jewish life, and we felt the essence of their strength and persistence, It was in the end the determination of the few to remain Jews, even at the price of exile. Given the choice, faith or conversion, they chose faith. Our story begins here at Gibraltar, where the great rock guards the straits between Spain and Morocco. Jews had lived in Spain since the 4th century, but a turning point came in the year 711, when Muslim forces led by Tariq Ziyad burst out of North Africa, crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, and swiftly captured Spain from her Christian rulers. Córdoba, on the banks of the Guadalquivir, became the capital city of Muslim Spain and would remain so for the next 2 centuries. The Jews gradually settled in the liberated cities of Seville, Toledo, Barcelona, and especially Córdoba. The mosque cathedral in Córdoba stands as a monument to the once mighty Muslim caliphate. Tens of thousands would gather to pray here, and every 100 years another section was added to the mosque to accommodate the growing number of worshippers. Within the walls of Córdoba, adjacent to the mosque, the Juderia, the Jewish quarter. The Jews were well known as doctors, tax officials, merchants, and craftsmen. Maimonides, the great Jewish rabbi, doctor, and philosopher, was born in Córdoba. Today, just a street name remains. And a portion of only one of the many synagogues which once graced Córdoba. Within this alcove stood the Holy Ark, inside were the scrolls of law. For hundreds of years the Jews lived under Muslim rule, sometimes in prosperity, sometimes persecuted, and always dependent. Until the 10th century, when the Christian reconquest of Spain, the Reconquista, began. As territory was captured, the Christian kings turned to the Jews who had served the Muslims to now help them resettle the newly conquered lands. Those Jews who did so often came in for special privileges and favors. Many rose to positions of power within the court and became men of means. Toledo, in the heart of Castilian Spain. Reconquered in 1085, Toledo developed into one of the greatest cultural centers in Europe. It also became the foremost Jewish community in the country.
Toledo, hundreds of years ago, a thriving Jewish center, home to some of Spanish Jewry's greatest rabbis, scholars, and poets. You can still walk through the old streets where the Jewish quarter once existed, but very little remains.
Toledo once had over 20 synagogues and Jewish study centers. Today there are the remains of only 2. The Santa Maria la Blanca, a 12th century synagogue, which was turned into a church. And the El Transito synagogue, built in the 14th century by the Jewish court treasurer Shmuel Halevi. Shmuel Halevi also built a magnificent home in the center of the town. After falling out of favor with the king, Pedro the Cruel, Halevi was executed and his house passed to a Spanish noble family. Later, the house became the home of the Greek-born artist Dominikos Theotokopoulos, better known as El Greco. By the time El Greco arrived in Toledo, there were no longer any Jews living there, but there were conversos, descendants of former Jews who had converted to Christianity, a number of whom posed for El Greco's series of apostles. Each Jewish community looked after its own affairs. The Jews enjoyed religious autonomy, but they were dependent on the favor of the royal court and often served in it. They became tax farmers, diplomats, men of science and medicine. Not everyone was satisfied with this state of affairs. Some said only the elite courtiers enjoyed the favors of kings, and that could change at any time. The Jewish Sephardi poet Yehuda Halevi put it more bluntly. He wrote, "Between the Christians and the Muslims, my people are lost. The house of Israel vanishes. They wage their wars and we fall when they fall. Thus it was ever with Israel." The church was also concerned about the Jews, but for completely different reasons. The church said it wasn't possible for Jews who had rejected Jesus to be in positions of power at the very heart of the Spanish court. The Jews must be discredited, separated from Christians, and made to convert. In 1263, the church arranged a debate in the Cathedral of Barcelona. Its aim, to prove once and for all the truth of Christianity over Judaism. Debating the issue was the most outstanding rabbi of the day, Moses ben Nachman, Nachmanides, and Pablo Cristiani, a former Jew who had become a leading Christian theologian. But once the debate began, Nachmanides outpointed Cristiani on every argument. After 4 days, the debate was halted. The church ordered entire passages in Jewish books deleted on the basis of their being heretical. Nachmanides, accused of blasphemy, fled Spain for Jerusalem. For the first time, the Jews felt they might not have a future in Christian Spain.
Almost all of Europe has been already Christian. The Jews are only, I would say, a thorn in this Christianity, and now a new ways should be taken, or propaganda, in order to influence the Jews that they should also convert and become part of the Christian world.
Professor Chaim Beinart of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem has dedicated most of his life to the study of Spanish Jewry and the Inquisition. He has received international recognition for his work on the subject.
The disputation of Barcelona was to prove that the Christ, the Messiah, has already come, that it is futile for the Jews to wait for the coming of their Messiah. And Nachmanides has already said, in one of his passages, he said that how can you claim that the Messiah has already come? We know that when the Messiah will come, no wars will be, and you Christians kill each other.
In the 14th century, bubonic plague swept Europe, and Jews were accused of spreading the Black Death. Many were put to the sword. The time was ripe for an all-out attack on the Jews. Seville, in the province of Andalusia. "600 years ago, an angry mob fell on the Jewish community of Seville, here in the Santa Cruz quarter. It was an attack which led to the downfall of civilian Jewry. It was 1391. Armed gangs burst into the quarter. 4,000 were slain, thousands more converted to Christianity to save their lives. Spain's leading rabbi, Hasdai Criscas, wrote, "The Lord bent his bow like an enemy against the Jewish community of Seville. They set fire to its gates and killed many of its people, but most changed their religion, and many died to sanctify the name of the Lord." The great synagogue of the quarter stood here in the square of Santa Cruz. After the Jews had fled Seville, it was turned into a church. The Sevillian artist Murillo was buried here. Later, the church was razed to the ground in the Napoleonic War, with only Murillo's tomb surviving the blaze. Barcelona, New Year's Eve. Crowds take to the streets to celebrate the arrival of 1992. Behind this street lie the few remains of the once great Jewish quarter. The riots of 1391 reached Barcelona in August. It was a Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath. Rioters stormed through the streets. 400 were killed. Rabbi Hasdai Criscas wrote, "Many sanctified the holy name, my only son among them. Many slaughtered themselves, and some were martyred in the street." By the end of 1391, most of the Jewish communities had been attacked. Tens of thousands had been slain and injured. Many more had converted to Christianity to escape the fury of the mob. Of the 700,000 Jews who lived in Spain at the time, a third were martyred or fled the country, a third converted, and a third remained Jews. The Jewish poet Solomon de Piera wrote, "Dispirited, they walk like a shadow, broken, shattered, afraid. Wherever they tread, they find no peace. We have been dealt with as strangers, as sheep for the slaughter."
Of course, there were a few who converted really, even before the riots. I would mention the name of Pablo de Santa Maria, formerly Shlomo Halevi, the chief rabbi of Burgos. There were other people who converted out of conviction, more or less. But you cannot speak of a multitude, probably of about 200,000 people, to all of them converted out of conviction. It must have been a weak moment for them, in which they saw a way to save their lives instead of being killed by the rioters.
Saragossa, the capital of Aragon. In 1391, the most important rabbi of the day, Hasdai Criscas, whose son had been killed in the Barcelona riots, was leader of the Jewish community in Saragossa. The king and queen had granted Criscas royal protection, and it was their presence which had prevented anti-Jewish riots breaking out in the town. In Saragossa, Criscas began to piece together what remained of the Jewish communities. Saragossa became the main Jewish center, with Rabbi Hasdai Criscas its undisputed leader. A Jewish scholar wrote, "Criscas was the greatest philosopher of his day, and he was the greatest of all King John's counselors, for the king did not lift up his hand to do anything, small or great, without him." Against Criscas stood Vincent Ferri, a preacher monk from Valencia who had been traveling from city to city for more than 20 years, stirring up crowds against the Jews. Ferri was determined to force them to convert. In the year 1412, using his influence in court, he realized his ambition.
The reformatory laws. They were aimed at separating Jews from Christians. No Jew could live with a Christian. Jews were obliged to wear a special badge.
Christians could no longer be treated by Jewish doctors. Jews could no longer farm taxes or do business with Christians. And most important, Jewish communal autonomy was to be abolished. Thousands of Jews converted out of fear for their future. But there was a problem. The laws really did block the Jews out of Christian society, and there was nobody to take their place. Important court functions were unfilled. In time, many of the laws were revoked or softened, but damage had been done, and the Jewish communities were more vulnerable than ever. Ferry met Joshua Halorki, the Pope's Jewish doctor, and persuaded him to become a Christian. Halorki did so and took the name Geronimo de Santa Fe. In August 1412, Geronimo wrote a memorandum which would serve as the basis for the disputation of Tortosa. In January 1413, the Pope commanded each Jewish community in the Kingdom of Aragon to send representatives to the papal court at Tortosa to answer the points raised in Geronimo's memorandum. One of the delegation wrote, "The Pope received us courteously and said, 'Notables of the Jewish people, a people chosen by the ancient chooser and rejected for your own sins, have no fear of the disputation. You will meet with no guile or wrong whatsoever.'" Geronimo reserved the right to open, close, and have the last word of every session. He declared his intention to prove Jesus the Messiah and to convince the Jews from their own books of the truth of Christianity. The disputation lasted 18 months. Its result, a foregone conclusion. The Tortosa disputation was considered an overwhelming victory for the Church. It was the signal to begin a new campaign against the Jews. Jewish books were censored and contact between Jews and Christians forbidden. Many Jews arrived at Tortosa to undergo baptism. The Church was certain that the Jews would soon all convert to Christianity. But the plan failed. The Pope, who had endorsed the campaign against the Jews, was forced to step down. The Jews were reprieved. But it was clear that from now on they would survive or perish at the whim of the Church and the monarchs. One of the Jewish defenders at Tortosa, Joseph Albo, wrote, "We have returned to the status of a slave who despairs of ever being freed, without anything of his own, and without even the right to practice his own religion and faith." Some, like Rabbi Solomon Alami, raged at the Jewish courtiers who in his view had betrayed themselves and their people. Alami wrote, "Those great men of the community who stand before kings in their castles and courts, they grew insolent in their wealth and greatness, and now there remains not a single Jew with access to the king to promote his people's welfare and intervene on its behalf." The true strength of Spanish Jewry was no longer in the cities where so many had converted, but among the simple Jews in the village of the countryside, where the flame of Judaism remained alight. In Sepulveda, in Trujillo, in Soria, and many other villages. Somehow, those who stayed Jews and many of the newly converted, the conversos, continued their Jewish traditions.
I would say the Jews' relation to the conversos was rather a relation as according to a certain Talmudical saying, a Jew, although he sinned, is always a Jew. They would accept him even in the prayers, in their minyanim, the prayers, would accept conversos. They would eat at a converso table, being aware that this converso keeps kashrut. They would circumcise them. They would act burial ceremonies according to the Jewish rites. No doubt they were considered by the Jews. There's no problem for Judaism to accept a converso who would repent his deed and lead, or clandestinely or openly, a Jewish way of life. The question is more how Christian society acted towards these conversions.
In the church, the question now arose of the loyalty of the newly converted, the conversos. In the eyes of the church, they were considered Christians, but many suspected the sincerity of their belief. Many more resented their success in the royal court and in business. The conversos had their defenders, but among the more extreme church leaders, the conversos were a heretical cancer, rotting the Catholic soul of Spain. The fact is that many conversos had returned to their Jewish roots. Many went to synagogue and observed the Jewish festivals. Outwardly, they were Christians. In their hearts, they were Jews. For some conversos, the advantages of having joined the church were obvious.
A high-placed converso courtier to the King of Aragon during the mid-15th century told a Jewish friend, "Could I, as a Jew, ever have risen higher than a rabbinical post? But now, see, I'm one of the chief councillors of the city. I'm accorded every honor, and I issue orders and decrees to the whole city of Saragossa. And who hinders me if I choose from fasting on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and keeping the Jewish festivals? I do as I please." Conversos of this kind would not be able to do as they pleased for much longer.
In the mid-15th century, riots broke out in Toledo between Christians and conversos. For years, resentment had been building up against converso wealth and influence. Several conversos were arrested, tortured, tried for living as Jews, and burnt at the stake. Similar riots between new and old Christians broke out in other towns. Conversos began to be afraid. Spain was on the verge of anarchy and civil war. Segovia, in the heartland of Castile. 8 days after Christmas, Segovians celebrate Epiphany, when the three kings brought gifts to the infant Jesus. Today, it's a carnival, mainly for children. Five centuries ago, Segovia was the home of Isabella, heiress to the Castilian crown. She had been exiled there by her brother Henry IV to prevent her plotting against him. In 1469, Isabella married Ferdinand, Prince of Aragon. The royal wedding was welcomed by all, including the Jews and the conversos, who believed that Isabella and Ferdinand would protect them. In Granada, in the mausoleum of the Capilla Real, lie the tombs of Isabella and Ferdinand, whose marriage signaled the final stage of Jewish life in Spain. By 1474, Isabella and Ferdinand were jointly reigning over Castile. 5 years later, Ferdinand ascended the throne of Aragon, and the two kingdoms were united. The castle of Castile and the rampant lion of Aragon were joined. The monarchs put down rebellions at home and met with success abroad.
There were some Jews who served Ferdinand and Isabella at court. The best known was Don Abraham Senior, the court rabbi, chief tax farmer, and judge of appeals for the Jews in Castile. But the real influence in court was with the prior of the monastery of Santa Cruz in Segovia, the confessor to the Queen, Thomas de Torquemada.
As far as religion was concerned, the royal couple had set an agenda to strengthen the Church as the one faith and Spain as a Christian state. To accomplish this, the conversos would have to be completely integrated. Granada, the last stronghold of Muslim Spain, would have to be conquered, and a solution to the Jewish problem would have to be found. The Church urged that an inquisition be empowered to deal with false conversos, and that the Jews be expelled. Only in this way could heretics be uprooted and contact severed between Christians and Jews. Isabella and Ferdinand revoked the rights of the Jewish communities to operate their own courts. Laws segregating Jews from Christians were re-invoked.
They saw that they had to extirpate certain heresies which they considered it. After all, a converso who is returning to the faith of his ancestors is considered a heretic. And they saw in certain ways they had to save these conversos who are returning to Judaism, and from hell. And how is it to be resolved? By burning the body in order to save their souls after sinning.
In January 1481, the Inquisition began in Seville, a large converso center. These are the recently discovered headquarters of the Seville Inquisition. Here, conversos were interrogated on charges of practicing Judaism and attempting to overthrow the kingdom. Within weeks, men and women were going to the stake. During the 7 years of Inquisition in Seville, some 750 were burnt alive. But ties between Jews and conversos continued. A new strategy was decided. In 1483, the Jews were expelled from Andalusia. They were given 1 month to leave. In the royal monastery in Avila, Thomas de Torquemada, the Inquisitor General, laid down the ground rules for the Inquisition. The number of judges, the authority to impose penalties, to torture those who made only partial confessions. The aim was to save the souls of lapsed conversos. Everything was conducted with the greatest secrecy. Accused prisoners were incarcerated in dungeons without contact with the outside world. Witnesses' testimonies were taken in secret, without the accused knowing who had testified against him. Prisoners, terrified for their lives, informed on others, dragging more conversos into the terror of Inquisition. The town of Ciudad Real was the testing ground for the Inquisition in La Mancha. It began with a 30-day Edict of Grace, which allowed for penitents to confess and be leniently treated. Many conversos fled the town. Then the trials began. They ended with what was called an auto de fe, an act of faith, the public sentencing of heretics. They began with an elaborate procession of the penitents, led by the local clergy through the town. The penitents were garbed in yellow robes marked with a black cross. Those sentenced to the stake wore the so-called San Benito robe, with flames painted upon it symbolizing the fires of hell. Once in the town square, they were subjected to the abuse of the crowds and a castigating sermon. Finally, one by one, they stepped forward to receive sentence. The entire ceremony was calculated to terrorize the watching crowds. Those sentenced to death were handed over to the secular authorities for burning. The smell of burnt flesh could be felt for days. One of those burnt was Maria Gonzalez. She was charged with observing Jewish holidays and of raising her 3 daughters in Jewish tradition. After she confessed, the judges sentenced her to death. The Inquisition gained ground. In Guadalupe, conversos were burnt every week for a year for living secretly as Jews. Even the dead could be judged. The bodies of dead conversos deemed secret Jews were exhumed and burnt. Others who had fled were burned in effigy. The Inquisition opened in Toledo. From February 1486 through May 1490, more than 100 conversos were executed as secret Jews, and thousands of others made to recant. The Inquisition had proven that ties did exist between conversos and Jews, and that in fact many conversos, and perhaps most, had continued to be Jews.
The converso Fernando Husilio, a treasurer of the Church of San Vicente in Toledo, confessed to the crimes of visiting Jewish homes and eating Jewish food. A witness testified that Husilio had secretly prayed in a synagogue during Yom Kippur. After a 6-month trial, Husilio was sentenced to death. Juan de Sevilla was a converso silk weaver arrested on charges of practicing Judaism. He told his interrogators all the evidence against him was false, but when he was brought to church to recant, he turned away and went to the stake in Toledo.
The Inquisition reached a climax with the trial of the Holy Child of La Guardia, a small town near Toledo. In June 1490, a converso craftsman, Benito Garcia, was arrested and tortured on charges of practicing Judaism. Garcia claimed he had returned to Judaism under the influence of a Jewish shoemaker called Yuke Franco. Yuke Franco was imprisoned at that time in Segovia in connection with the killing of a boy during Holy Week in La Guardia. Yuke confessed that 3 years before he had gone to La Guardia to buy flour for Passover from his brother, Alonso, a converso. Alonso was interrogated and forced to confess that one Holy Friday he and his brother had crucified a boy. The body of the child was never looked for, nor ever found. The Franco brothers and Benito Garcia were charged with the so-called murder and transferred to Avila, where Torquemada would supervise their trial personally. In November 1491, Yuke Franco and Benito Garcia both went to the stake in Avila. The entire trial was a sham. Confessions had been gained under torture. Official records show no 2 sets of evidence match. The name of the child was never revealed, nor his grave ever found. But Torquemada had staged the show trial of the Inquisition and had set the scene for his ultimate goal, the expulsion of the Jews. Granada in Andalusia, the holiday season. In 1491, as the new year approached, Granada, the last bastion of Muslim Spain, surrendered to the Christian forces. The reconquest was complete. Isabella and Ferdinand ruled over a united Christian Spain. On January the 6th, 1492, a triumphant royal procession entered the city of Granada. In the Alhambra Palace stands this fountain ringed by 12 lions symbolizing the tribes of Israel. It was a gift of the Jews to the Muslim Caliphate. But now, the magnificent Alhambra, the Muslim jewel of Granada, was in the hands of Isabella and Ferdinand.
By their mounting the throne of the United Spain, of United Castile and Aragon, their ideology was to found and unite a Christian country. There were only 2 minorities. By conquering Granada, they will clean European soil from Islam. The second step should be to expel the Jews from Spain, and in pari passu, on the same steps, they would solve the problem of the conversos, of the false conversos who were trying to return to the faith of their ancestors by the Inquisition. By throwing out the Jews from Spain or by expelling them, they believed that Spain will become united, as with the slogan which was later coined, unus pastor et unum ovile. I would say 1 shepherd and 1 flock, or 1 sword and 1 empire.
After the surrender of Granada, a fateful meeting took place here in the Ambassador Hall of the Alhambra. Inquisitor General Torquemada met with Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand and convince them that as long as there were Jews in Spain, the conversos' loyalty to the church was at risk. Only by exiling the Jews would Spain be truly Christian. On March 31st, 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand signed the Edict of Expulsion. The edict recorded that efforts to separate the Jews from the Christians and to eliminate the Jewish influence over the conversos had failed. The last resort was complete expulsion. The Jews were commanded to leave the country within 3 months of the 1st of May, by order of the king and queen and by the grace of God. Guadalupe, in Extremadura. In June 1492, the aging Abraham Señor, the last court rabbi of Castile and acting head of the Jewish community, was ceremonially baptized before the monarchs. In this way, the queen had ensured that her favorite court Jew would serve her to his dying day. It was, for her, a victory over Judaism. The Edict of Expulsion defined the method of the Jews' departure, the routes they should follow and what they might take with them. No money, gold, silver, or precious stones could be taken out of the country. No gunpowder, livestock, or corn. They were to leave carrying only sufficient clothes and food for the way. Presented with the cold facts of expulsion, some Jews chose conversion. But about 200,000 placed their trust in God and set about preparing their exodus. Gerona, the city which had enjoyed a continuous Jewish presence of 600 years, now emptied out. These streets, which had resounded to the sounds of Jewish prayer, became silent. Gerona, home to some of the greatest Jewish scholars, where the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism had flourished, now stood vacant. Today, only one house in all Gerona has the niche in the doorframe where a mezuzah, a Jewish scroll, had been encased. Each community wrapped up its affairs as best it could. So it was in Trujillo, in Sepulveda, in Soria. They left behind their homes, their synagogues, their cemeteries. Jewish communal property was taken over by the church and the state. All over Spain, the Jews left the towns and villages where they had lived for generations. In May 1492, the exile began. Contracts were signed with Genoese, Basque and Portuguese shipowners to sail the Jews to North Africa and Italy. Many left from here, the port of Cadiz, on the southern coast of Andalusia. Others sailed from Seville, Sagunto and Tortosa. Eyewitnesses said the Jews departed with great dignity. Community after community left Spain not knowing what the future held for them, but still singing the praises of the Lord. Palos, once a thriving port on the Huelva estuary, here Christopher Columbus prepared a voyage which would change man's perception of the world.
Columbus sailed for the New World from Palos and drew water for his voyage from this well behind me. Thousands of Jews, exiled from Spain, also sailed from Palos for new shores, some say delaying Columbus's departure by 2 days.
The old port of Palos is no more. It's been silted up for centuries. But lower down the estuary at Huelva, Columbus still searches out new lands on the distant horizon. Most of the Jews left Spain on foot. 120,000 crossed into Portugal, from where they would be expelled again a few years later. 50,000 crossed the Straits of Gibraltar to North Africa. The rest sailed to different ports of the Mediterranean.
I would call it an act of strength. Given 3 months to leave, it is not easy. You have to decide what to take with you, who is going, where to go, how to prepare yourself to sell what you have. Let us not forget that the Jews lived in Spain for about 1500 years. Deep into the land, agriculturers, laborers, workmen, almost all the fields of society were represented. You found the representations of Jews. And yet, I would say, people have a deep belief that the time of redemption has come to them. It is a messianic era has come. They believed that by going out of Spain, it is a new exodus in which God will again divide the sea and they will be able to cross the land and go to the promised land as they believed it.
By the end of July, there were no more Jews in Spain. The exile opened a new cycle of Jewish history. In North Africa, in the Ottoman Empire, in Europe, in the Holy Land, and later in the New World. A 1,000 years of Jewish life in Spain had come to an end. For the Church, the exile was the final act in securing a unified Catholic Spain. For the Jews, it was the final choice, to join the Church and stay in Spain, or to keep their faith and go to exile. They chose faith.